The heavy fog that rolled over Oakhaven Valley on the morning of October 14th, 1998, did not just bring the cold. It brought a silence so thick and heavy that it felt like the earth itself had stopped breathing. The frost clung to the rusted iron gates of the Thorne family farm, shimmering faintly in the pale gray light of dawn. Elias Thorne stood perfectly still by the wooden fence of his main holding pen, the frozen mud crunching softly beneath his worn leather boots. He was a man carved from the very landscape he worked with deep lines etched into his face from decades of harsh sun and bitter wind. But on this morning, the lines on his face were drawn tight with a quiet, monolithic dread. Before him lay his entire livelihood. 60 head of prize-winning Black Angus cattle. But they were not moving. They were entirely prone, scattered across the frozen earth like massive fallen stones. Their breath came in shallow, ragged gasps that plumed in the freezing air. Their eyes were glazed over, staring blindly at the gray sky, and their massive bodies trembled with a violent, involuntary shudder that they could not control. Standing a few feet away, forming a jarring contrast to the dirt and the despair of the farm, was Dr. Vance Sterling. Vance was the county's newest, most expensive, and most highly decorated veterinary specialist. He had arrived in a pristine, mud-free silver SUV that looked like an alien spaceship parked next to Elias's battered tractor. Vance wore a spotless tan trench coat and expensive leather gloves. He did not step into the pen. He did not kneel in the mud to listen to the heartbeat of the dying animals. He stood at a safe distance, holding a sleek silver clipboard with the kind of casual, detached grip that told you he had already made up his mind before he even turned off his engine. Vance clicked his expensive silver pen, let out a loud theatrical sigh that cut through the quiet morning and dethrored the death sentence. He spoke with the absolute certainty of a man who believed his university degree made him a god of the pasture. He told Elias it was a highly aggressive, newly mutated neurological virus, something spreading through the state, something modern medicine could not touch, let alone reverse. He told the old farmer that the herd was completely finished. He said that by nightfall, every single animal in that pen would be dead, and the only logical, responsible thing to do was to hire a backhoe, dig a mass grave at the edge of the property, and call the insurance company. Elias did not say a word. He did not argue. He just stared out at the field, his rough, calloused hands gripping the top rail of the wooden fence until the splinters bit into his palms and his knuckles turned stark white. But there was something nobody knew about Vance Sterling. He was not just a man who delivered bad news. He was a man who enjoyed being the smartest person in the room. A man who believed that anyone who didn't farm with a computer and synthetic chemicals was a relic of a dead age. Later that afternoon, the bitter wind drove half the county into the local feed and hardware store. The air inside smelled of roasted coffee, sweet grain, and diesel oil. It was a place where farmers gathered to warm their hands and talk about the coming winter. Elias had walked in quietly, hoping to simply buy a heavy coil of fencing wire and leave without having to look any of his neighbors in the eye. But Vance was already there. He was standing near the front counter, holding court with a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. Standing right next to him was Thomas Weaver, the lead loan officer for the regional bank. When the bell above the door chimed and Elias walked in, the room naturally grew quiet. But Vance did not lower his voice. He raised it. Vance laughed a dry, sharp, cutting laugh that echoed off the metal tin roof. He pointed his coffee cup toward the old farmer, making sure every farmhand, every cashier, and every corporate landowner in the store was listening. He called Elias a walking fossil. He loudly mocked the Thorne family's traditional methods, telling the crowd that if Elias had just modernized his feeding systems, if he had just bought into the expensive patented chemical immune boosters Vance had been pushing all summer, his cattle wouldn't be out there, dropping dead in the mud like flies. Vance leaned against the counter, looked Elias dead in the eye, and smiled a cold corporate smile. He said it was time to give up the ghost. He told Elias to sell the land to a corporate conglomerate who actually knew what century it was before the bank took it from him, for absolutely nothing, to be stripped of your dignity in front of the men you have known your whole life, to be called useless, ignorant, and obsolete by a man half your age, who had never planted a single seed or pulled a calf in the middle of a blizzard. That is a specific kind of humiliation that breaks most men. It makes them shout. It makes them throw punches. It makes them surrender. But Elias did not break. He simply set his money on the counter, picked up his heavy spool of wire, tipped his worn canvas hat to the cashier, and walked back out into the freezing wind. I need to stop here and tell you something important about the man they were laughing at. What Vance Sterling and the banker did not understand was that Elias Thorne was built from a completely different kind of material. He was a man made of quiet soil, generational patience, and an inherited resilience that you cannot learn in a sterile classroom. The blood of the Thorne family had mixed with the dirt of Oakhaven Valley since the late 1890s. They were not corporate investors. They were survivors. Elias remembered the stories of his grandfather surviving droughts that cracked the earth so wide open it swallowed tractor tires. He remembered the blizzards that buried the farmhouse up to the second-story windows. But most importantly, as he drove his rattling, rusted pickup truck back toward the silent, dying farm, he thought of his grandmother. Her name was Eleanor. During the crushing desperation of the Great Depression, when the banks were taking everything and the dust storms were choking the life out of the country, Eleanor kept the Thorne farm alive. She was a legend in her own time, a woman the old-timers used to call the soil whisperer. Eleanor did not have a college degree. She barely had an 8th-grade education. But she had something far more powerful. She had absolute, undivided observation. She possessed an intimate, almost spiritual connection with the land. She taught a young Elias that the earth, the weather, the plants, and the animals all spoke a continuous, ancient language. She taught him that sickness in an animal was rarely just a random attack by nature. It was usually the land trying to tell you that something was out of balance. Elias didn't argue with the arrogant veterinarian at the store because he knew that words were incredibly cheap. Men like Vance Sterling read books written by other men in laboratories. But grandmother Eleanor had read the earth itself. And as the old pickup truck bounced down the rutted dirt driveway toward his doomed herd, a strange, distant memory flickered in the back of Elias's mind. It was a memory from when he was just a little boy holding his grandmother's apron. A memory of a strange, bitter year when the autumn frost came incredibly late, just exactly like this one, and the animals in the valley had started falling to the ground. When Elias pushed open the heavy oak door of his farmhouse, the house was dark and bitterly cold. The fire in the hearth had died hours ago, but he did not stop to light it. He did not go to the kitchen to heat up a can of soup, and he certainly did not walk over to the rotary telephone on the wall to call the bankruptcy lawyers like Vance Sterling had suggested. Instead, he walked straight past the living room, his heavy boots echoing on the hardwood floor, and climbed the narrow, creaking staircase up to the attic. He reached the top of the stairs and pulled the frayed string of a single dust-covered light bulb. The pale yellow light flickered on, revealing a space that smelled of dry cedar wood mothballs and the quiet passage of time. Elias walked over to a heavy iron-banded trunk sitting in the far corner beneath a frosted window. He knelt down, his old joints popping in the cold, and unlatched the heavy brass lock. Inside, buried beneath folded, faded patchwork quilts and a tin box of sepia photographs, was exactly what he was looking for. It was a thick, heavy journal bound in dark, cracked leather. The cover was stained with dried rain tractor grease and the sweat of decades of hard labor. It was Grandmother Eleanor's personal farm logbook. He carefully lifted it with both hands, treating it with more reverence than a bank vault full of gold, and carried it downstairs to the kitchen table. Elias brewed a pot of thick black coffee on the gas stove, put on his reading glasses, and sat down in the quiet house. Outside, the sun was sinking below the tree line, casting long, desperate shadows over the fields, where his herd lay suffocating in the frost. The clock on the wall was ticking like a judge's gavel. The banker was surely at his desk at this very moment, sipping scotch and drafting the foreclosure papers for the Thorne estate. Elias opened the brittle yellowed pages, his finger tracing the elegant, fading cursive of a woman who had spent 80 years listening to the heartbeat of the valley. He read past the entries about repairing old tractor engines with scrap iron, past the meticulous notes on rotating corn and alfalfa, according to the phases of the moon. And then, near the very back of the heavy book, in an entry dated November 1934, he found it. But there was something nobody knew, something that wasn't written in any modern veterinary textbook, something that a shiny Ivy League degree could never teach you. What Elias found on that frail piece of paper would change absolutely everything. The sickness killing his beautiful black Angus herd was not a virus. It was not a contagious, newly mutated disease that required $1 million synthetic chemical cure. Grandmother Eleanor had described the exact same terrifying symptoms in her logbook: the shallow, ragged breathing, the eyes glazing over, the sudden, violent paralysis of the legs. She noted that this terrifying phenomenon only ever happened in years, when a severe late autumn drought was immediately followed by a sudden, unexpected deep frost. This highly specific, bizarre combination of weather caused a microscopic, highly toxic fungus to bloom deep on the roots of wild red clover, a plant that grew abundantly in the lower, wetter pastures of the Thorne farm. The cows had not caught a modern virus. They were severely poisoned. And modern science, with all its sterile laboratories and expensive diagnostic equipment, had completely missed it, because they were looking for a complex modern problem, not an ancient, quiet trap set by nature herself. More importantly, Grandmother Eleanor had written down the remedy. It was not a chemical injection. It was a brutal, physical emergency purge. The book described a thick, heavy drench made from activated oak charcoal, the boiled roots of the wild marshmallow plant, and a very specific type of alkaline red clay that could only be found near the western ridge of the farm property. The mixture was designed to coat the stomach lining, bind directly to the neurotoxins, and neutralize the paralysis before it could reach the animals' hearts. What happened next was the part that nobody in Oakhaven Valley ever forgot. Night had fully fallen. The temperature plummeted well below freezing, turning the mud in the yard to solid ice. Elias did not sleep. He grabbed a kerosene lantern, a heavy iron pickaxe, and a rough burlap sack, and he walked out into the freezing, pitch-black darkness. He hiked 2 miles uphill to the western ridge, the bitter wind cutting through his heavy coat, his breath frosting thickly in the air. He swung the pickaxe into the frozen, unyielding earth, jarring his shoulders with every strike until he had harvested enough of the deep alkaline red clay. He carried the heavy sack back to the farm and immediately built a roaring bonfire in the dirt yard. He threw massive old oak logs into the flames, waiting for them to burn down to pure white-hot embers, then dragged them out and crushed them into a fine black ash. He set up a massive steel trough over a propane burner, boiling gallons of water, and began mixing the thick, muddy black concoction. His back screamed in pain. His calloused hands blistered from the intense heat of the fire and the biting cold of the wind. But he refused to stop. By midnight, Elias was moving through the frozen cattle pen like a ghost on a mission. He knelt beside each massive dying animal in the freezing mud. He used every ounce of his remaining strength to pry their heavy locked jaws open and forced the warm black liquid down their throats using an old rubber drenching tube. 60 cows. 60 times he had to fight the dead, crushing weight of a 1,000-pound animal. His muscles burned, his chest heaved, and his clothes were soaked through with freezing mud sweat and spilled charcoal water. He was an old man, fighting the grim reaper alone in the dark, armed with nothing but dirt ash and the memory of an old woman. As the first pale gray light of dawn began to break over the eastern hills, the escalation reached its absolute peak. The deep, heavy rumble of powerful diesel engines echoed down the valley road, shattering the morning peace. It was Vance Sterling's pristine silver SUV, leading the convoy. Right behind him was the sleek black sedan belonging to Thomas Weaver, the bank's loan officer. And pulling up the rear was a massive, roaring flatbed truck carrying a heavy yellow backhoe. They were coming to dig the mass graves. They were coming to claim the land. They had timed their arrival perfectly, showing up at dawn, to catch the old farmer at his absolute weakest planning, to force a broken man to sign away his family's legacy while he stared at a field of rotting corpses. Vance stepped out of his heated vehicle, wearing a thick designer coat and holding a steaming cup of premium coffee in his gloved hand. He looked incredibly smug, wearing the victorious smile of a man who was about to prove he was right all along. He walked up to the wooden fence, fully expecting to see the tragedy he had so confidently predicted the day before. He was already preparing a speech in his head, something condescending and sympathetic about the harsh realities of agriculture and the inevitability of corporate progress. But this story wasn't really about the medicine. It was about pride. And pride always falls the hardest. Vance Sterling stopped dead in his tracks. His arrogant smile vanished. The premium coffee cup slipped right through his expensive leather gloves, hitting the frozen gravel and shattering spilling brown liquid across the frost. The loan officer stepped out of his sedan, a leather briefcase in his hand, and his jaw literally dropped open. There, in the swirling morning mist, Elias Thorne was sitting quietly on an overturned wooden bucket. He was smoking a battered wooden pipe. He was covered head to toe in black soot ash and red mud, looking utterly exhausted. But he sat there like a mountain that could not be moved. And behind him, inside the holding pen, the impossible had happened. The herd was not dead. They were not even lying down. One by one, the massive black beasts were shifting their weight, standing firm on their legs. A few were already walking slowly toward the heated water troughs. Others were actively pulling at the dry hay Elias had laid out in the feeders. The terrifying, cloudy glaze in their eyes was completely gone, replaced by the bright, clear alertness of living, healthy animals. The toxins had been flushed. The old magic, the deep forgotten wisdom of the earth, had worked perfectly. Vance pushed his way violently to the fence, his face turning pale white, his hands visibly shaking. He began to stutter, his voice cracking as he demanded to know what illegal experimental drugs Elias had smuggled onto the property. He screamed that it was medically impossible, that the virus should have liquefied their nervous systems by midnight, that the old man must be breaking federal law. Elias did not rush. He slowly took the wooden pipe from his mouth, stood up, and walked over to the fence. He looked at the trembling, panicked veterinarian, and then he looked at the terrified banker who was slowly backing away toward his car. Elias didn't shout. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He simply reached deep into his heavy, mud-stained coat pocket, pulled out a thick handful of the dried red clay and crushed oak ash, and dropped it right into Vance Sterling's pristine, trembling hands. The black soot stained the veterinarian's expensive leather gloves instantly. Elias looked him dead in the eye, his voice low, steady, and carrying the weight of 100 years of Thorn history. He said there is a very big difference between having a fancy degree and having an actual education. My grandmother says good morning. Now get your heavy machinery off my land before I call the sheriff. The payoff of that freezing October morning was absolute, and the silence that followed Elias Thorn's words was heavier than the fog itself. There was nothing Vance Sterling could say, and there was absolutely nothing the banker could do. The animals were alive, breathing steady and warm in the morning air. The farm was financially secure, held together by the stubborn grace of a man who simply refused to break. The arrogant men had to turn their heavy, expensive machines around and drive away down the dirt road in total crushing defeat. The heavy yellow backhoe that was brought to dig graves ended up simply kicking up dust as it retreated, a hollow symbol of modern arrogance, chased off by a man with dirt under his fingernails and a pocket full of crushed charcoal. The aftermath of that morning reverberated through Oakhaven Valley for years to come. In a small farming community, word travels faster than a prairie fire. And by the end of the week, everyone from the local diner to the county courthouse knew exactly what had happened out on the Thorn estate. When Elias brought his truck to the dairy cooperative the following Tuesday, the atmosphere had entirely shifted. The very same men who had looked down at their boots while Vance mocked him at the feed store now stepped aside to let him pass. They took off their canvas hats in quiet respect. Younger farmers' men who had previously spent thousands of dollars on the newest synthetic chemicals began driving out to Elias's property just to lean on his fence and ask for his advice. They wanted to know about the old ways. They wanted to know how to read the frost, how to understand the weeds, and how to listen to the soil. As for Dr. Vance Sterling, his pristine reputation shattered just as easily as his coffee cup had on the frozen gravel. The massive corporate farm owners, the men who only cared about profit margins and spreadsheets, quickly realized a terrifying truth. If an expensive, highly decorated expert could entirely misdiagnose a whole herd and order 60 healthy animals to be buried in a ditch, he was not a visionary. He was a massive financial liability. Nobody trusted his polished clipboard or his expensive synthetic packages anymore. Within 6 months, Vance's shiny silver SUV was seen packed to the roof, driving out of the valley for good, leaving behind a community that had remembered how to trust themselves again. The bank loan officer, Thomas Weaver, quietly shredded the foreclosure papers and never drove out to the western ridge again. But the most remarkable part of the story was not the defeat of the arrogant men. It was what Elias Thorn did after he won. He did not go to the town hall to gloat. He did not write a book, and he did not seek out applause. He simply washed the soot off his face, fed his dogs, and went right back to work. He kept waking up 2 hours before dawn, walking the fence lines, and tending to the land that his ancestors had bled into. He remained exactly as humble as the dirt beneath his boots, because Elias understood the deepest moral of a life lived close to the earth. Never laugh at something just because it is old, and never dismiss the quiet people who work with their hands. In a room full of loud voices boasting about money, degrees, and innovation, the man who stays silent usually hides a depth of knowledge that you cannot buy in any classroom. We live in a world that is obsessed with the new, the fast, and the shiny. We are so quick to throw away the old machines, the old books, and the old wisdom, mistakenly believing that because we have new technology, we have somehow outsmarted the past. We confuse convenience with wisdom. We mistake arrogance for strength, but true strength does not come from a laboratory, and it certainly does not come from a bank account. True strength comes from roots. It comes from the quiet, unyielding respect for the things that came before us. Because when the real storms come, when the bitter cold wind blows, and the highly paid experts tell you that all is lost, and you should just surrender your shiny modern tools will not save you. It is your roots that will keep you standing. The soil remembers absolutely everything. It remembers the droughts, the floods, the blood, and the survival of generations. And if you are humble enough to stop talking, put your hands in the dirt, and truly listen, the earth will always tell you exactly what you need to survive.